1927 that King Tut's burial place was excavated in Egypt, and in that burial ground or burial place there, they found a jar full of seeds. Now these seeds go back 3,000 years, but when they took the seeds and planted them in fertile ground, lo and behold, they produced the same thing that they had produced, or that had produced those seeds 3,000 years before. And I find that amazing. But it's true, nevertheless, that the seed that was good 3,000 years ago and produced a beautiful plant then, produces the same plant 3,000 years later. W. Phillips was a teacher of restoration history at Alabama Christian College, and he died just about 2 years ago, and it's unfortunate. I have some of his writings, and I really appreciated the man. He developed Alzheimer's and then died from pneumonia, I believe, not too long after developing Alzheimer's. But he was able to travel to Egypt, and in the museum in Cairo, he saw the result of some of those seeds that had been taken from King Tut's grave. There they were blooming and making a beautiful plant right there in the museum. Well, I think you can see where we're going with that, because we're talking about planting a seed that goes back 2,000 years ago. The same seed that was planted then, when it's planted now, will produce today what it produced then. I have a little article here that says, age-old seed could nip aging. I don't know if you saw that. That was, what, a couple of weeks ago. Well, it's November the 14th. This appeared in the Senate and Register. And it says, a marble-sized lotus seed that lay dormant in a Manchurian dry lake bed for over 12 centuries is the oldest living seed ever germinated. I think that's probably to be debated in view of what was taken out of King Tut's grave. But this little seed, it said, slept for more than 1,000 years, sprouted in 4 days, just like its modern sibling, said plant physiologist Jane Shin Miller. So we have the same principle there of a seed being dormant for thousands of years, or hundreds of years, and then finally being placed in the ground, and lo and behold, it produced exactly what it produced originally. Well, in the 8th chapter of the book of Mark, Jesus said, in verse 8, the seed is the word of God. That's from a very familiar parable of the soils, or the parable of the sower, as some call it. But seed will always produce after its kind. Apple seeds will produce what? Apples. Peach seeds will produce peaches. Cucumber seeds will produce cucumbers. When I was a teenager, a fellow named Hollis Prine, I don't even know why I remember his name. Hollis was making this point, and he said, pickle seed will produce pickles. Well, I don't know if you know about farming, but pickle seeds don't produce pickles. Cucumber seeds produce cucumbers, and you make pickles out of them. But the principle is what we're talking about here. A watermelon seed, when it's planted, will not produce a peach tree. It will always produce a watermelon plant. So the spiritual seed, the Word of God, will produce Christians and Christians only. When this spiritual seed was sown in the 1st century, what did it produce? It produced just Christians, not hyphenated Christians or a Christian type. It produced Christians, and Christians only. So that's what we're talking about here. Now, God provides the way for restoration. The church that Jesus established, He established it the way that He wanted it, but it didn't stay faithful that awfully long. It fell into a state of apostasy, and by that we mean falling away from the truth. The resulting body hardly resembled the church that Jesus established. Is the situation hopeless? No, because restoration is possible, and God provided us with the means of restoration. Retain, it says, retain the standard of sound words which you have heard from me in the faith and love which are in Christ Jesus. 2 Timothy 1 and 3. Retain the standard. The 1901 American Standard uses the term pattern. Well, as long as man has the pattern, as long as he has the map, as long as he has the compass, he can find his way back to where God wants him to be. The old plea, return to the Bible, began to be heard in the early 1800s in this country, but that really wasn't the beginning. The plea for restoration was then and still is a plea to return to God's original plan as revealed in the Scripture. Now, the Apostle Paul told us that there was going to be an apostasy or a falling away. Listen to what he had to say. Let no one in any way deceive you, for it will not come unless the apostasy comes first, and the man of lawlessness be revealed, the son of destruction, who opposed and exalts himself above every so-called God or object of worship. He takes his seat in the temple of God, displaying himself as being God. So this is a very serious matter that Paul is talking about. So we shouldn't be surprised when the apostasy occurred. The church, as Jesus established, did not remain faithful for very long. And once it occurred, people probably began to think the whole thing is hopeless. But for centuries it got worse. It just kept getting worse and worse and worse, until finally some very brave men, courageous men, stepped outside the denominational concept and began to call people back to the restoration of the Word, restoration of the church. As man fell from the divine pattern, so he can find his way back. The pattern is there. The compass is there to lead us back. The marks of the apostasy are well known historically. They can be charted. Departure from the truth unfolded gradually. There wasn't suddenly one day we have a faithful church and the next day everything is wrong. It unfolded over several centuries, in fact, but in three categories. Number one was the corruption of church government. Now, in the beginning, each church was autonomous. It had elders and deacons to work with that congregation as they qualified themselves. But as time went on, and E.M. Borden places the date at 150 A.D. when they began to select head elders. Here we have a congregation with, say, the 3 elders. Well, they would say, all right, let's select among the 3 to have a head elder. And another congregation does the same, and another does the same, and another does the same. And then all the head elders get together, and they want to choose a head elder. Well, let's call one priest, and let's call the other bishop, and let's call this element over here archbishop, and you see how it continues to grow. But that's a corruption of the original church government as the Lord intended it to be. So that's the first area. Second area was the contamination of worship. There's a historian named Mosheim who says the Christian worship consisted, and I think it's interesting, what did they do in their worship? Consisted in hymns, prayers, the reading of the scriptures, a discourse addressed to the people, and concluded with the celebration of the Lord's Supper. And he concludes it just that simple. That was a simple worship of the New Testament church. But then as time went on, they began to complicate this, to adulterate this, to add this, and to add that. And so it no longer resembled the original simplicity of the New Testament worship. Then the third area was the change in form and subject of baptism. Baptism in New Testament times, in the Scriptures, was immersion in water for a penitent believer for the remission of sins. Well, not too long a period went by before they began to substitute, instead of believing adults, infants, instead of burying them in water, they began to substitute sprinkling and pouring. We're going to go over some of these in a little more detail later. Since the seed, though, will always produce after its kind, then it follows that if we want to be the New Testament church today, whether we're in Ghana, Africa, or whether we're in Corona, California, if we go back to the Word, if we apply the Word that's there, we can achieve the same thing that was achieved originally in the first century. It will always produce the New Testament church, if it is held in its purity, not adulterated, not changed. Let me illustrate the principle in this way. I love baseball. Most of the country loves baseball. Not just this country. Japan's crazy about it. Other countries as well. But let's just say, as much as we like baseball, that for some strange, unforeseen reason, we all stopped going to baseball games. We stopped watching it. We stopped talking about it. We stopped reading about it. For 100 years, nobody thinks about baseball. Nobody reads about it. Nobody talks about it. For 100 years. Now, at the end of that 100 years, someone finds a rule book. And they said, let's let's follow this rule book and see what we come up with. So they read the rule book. This game is called baseball. This is how many it has? 9 people on a team. And so they lay it all out. They lay the bases out just like they ought to be. There's a home base, a first, second, and there's a third. There's a pitcher so far out there. We got 3 fielders. It has a bat this size. It has a ball this size. And so they go item by item right down the line, and they begin to put everything in the rule book into practice. What game are they going to have when they finish? Volleyball? Are they going to have wrestling? Are they going to have boxing? No, they're going to have baseball. Exactly as we play it today. 100 years from now. Why? Because they have the rule book that we follow today. So there's the principle that if we want to repeat what was done in the first century, we can do it. But we've got to go back to the pattern. We've got to go back to the standard. So it is with the church. When the church went into apostasy, the rule book was virtually thrown away. Now, to bring the New Testament back, we're going to have to bring the rule book back and follow it. And that way we can establish the church in modern times. That's exactly what Alexander Campbell and Barton Stone, these men did. They went to the rule book and said, why, there's no justification for this. We can't have this practice. We can't have this teaching. Why? Because it's not in here. If it's not in here, we can't have it. And it's just as simple as that. Now, in this study, we want to look at some of those men who called us back, who looked around and they said, look at what we're doing. This is not even similar to the church that Jesus established. The departures are so obvious. So all we have to do is to go back. Now these are great men, courageous men, who called us back. And we're going to look at the restoration through their eyes by looking at their lives. But this is not to say that these men are to be revered, that these men are to be worshipped. They are not the standard of authority by any means. They are not authority at all. Sometimes they were wrong. Sometimes they had to change their position when they found that they were wrong. They changed their position. They're just men with feet of clay. So let's appreciate them when they're right and observe when they're wrong, and we don't worship them in either way. Well, let me give you just a real quick overview of the restoration of the United States. With the coming of the 1800s, there were various forces at work in various denominations that were not content with the state of Christendom as they saw it departing so far from the New Testament standard. And this was not just one denomination. This seemed to affect all of the major denominations. For example, James O'Kelly came out of the Methodist Church. He was a fiery Methodist preacher. Abner Jones was a Baptist. So was Elias Smith. They were both in the New England area. Both of them came out of the Baptist church. Barton Stone was a Presbyterian. Alexander Campbell and his father Thomas Campbell were from the Seceder Presbyterian Church. And good old Raccoon John Smith was a Baptist. He was a fiery Baptist preacher. And we're going to talk primarily about Alexander and Thomas Campbell and Barton Stone, Walter Scott, and Raccoon John Smith. And if you wonder why Raccoon John Smith, I guess because I like him so much. And if I like him, I think you're going to like him too. I appreciate him, and he's a colorful character, and he was a real pioneer in restoring the New Testament church to earth. But John Smith was a Baptist, and a very influential Baptist, and it was by 1830, and this is a very few short years after the Restoration got started, 10,000 Baptists left the Baptist church to plea for a restoration of New Testament Christianity. And this man, Raccoon John Smith, was one of those forces that moved in that area, and so was Alexander Campbell, as a matter of fact. And we'll talk about him later, how he happened to get tied up with the Baptist. Without question, if you were to select the two top men in the Restoration movement, it would be Barton W. Stone and Alexander Campbell. If you were to say, all right, what are the top four? It would be Alexander, Thomas, Walter Scott, and Barton Stone. Not in that order. Chronologically, we would start with Barton W. Stone. But those were the four men who would be, I think, put up there as the most influential of all the leaders of the Restoration movement. But this almost suggests that the hundreds of others that participated weren't important at all, and I don't believe that for a moment. I just love to read Restoration history, and I've got several books. And I began reading about these men that I've never heard of, and they've converted 1,000 people here. They starved to death almost, literally, in order to preach the word. And I'm just inspired to read about these men. And yet, probably not one person in 1,000 of the church has ever heard of some of these men. There were hundreds of them that were out there not being paid to preach. They were out there doing the best they could. They'd scrape a little bit of ground and try to farm a little bit, leave their wife there to take care of it. They'd go off and preach and come back with their dirty clothes and throw their dirty clothes down and pick up some fresh ones and head off again, and the poor wife would be scrubbing on the board and trying to farm. And so it was a kind of a combined effort. The women supported the men, but the men went out there and about starved themselves to death. They would go, sometimes they might walk 25 miles in a snowstorm in order to preach to some congregation that would give them maybe a chicken or a pound of potatoes for their trouble. So these are men that we love to read about, but we're going to limit in our study our discussion to just 5 of those good men. I'm going to try, if time will allow us, to mention some of these other people, but not to any great depth. Well, this religious movement that started because of the people that said, this is not right, what we have here. We need to get back to the Bible. Let's go back through the centuries, back all the way to the New Testament times. And no, they're not going to restore the church at Corinth. And sometimes I hear people say, well, if you believe in restoring, which church are you going to restore? Corinth with all of its problems? No, we're talking about the standard that's going to be restored. We're not going to restore the problems. We're not going to restore the false teachings or the false practices that might have gone on in some place. No, not at all. We're talking about restoring the standard. But as this movement caught fire, it became, by the year 1850, in that census, it was the 4th largest religious group in the United States. I find that absolutely amazing. The 4th largest in such a few short years, 1850. Between 1850 and 1860, the church was the fastest growing religious body in all of the United States. So the thing has caught fire. They're converting thousands over in the Western Reserve. Walter Scott in the 1830s was just going crazy over there preaching, and people were responding. And so it was the fastest growing church of that decade. Unfortunately, the unity that existed then stopped existing. Problems began to raise their head. The seed of division was planted in 1849 with the missionary society coming into existence. It didn't divide the church until later, but the seed was there, and it began to cause problems. Then the instrument of music was introduced about 1860. The preacher down at Midway, Kentucky, I'm trying to say, Midway, Kentucky, introduced the melodeon. And my wife and I were down there just a few months ago and saw that little melodeon, such a little guy, to cause so much trouble. But the trouble really started to show itself after the Civil War, and a division began to occur. Congregations that could not tolerate the missionary society, could not tolerate the instrument, were forced to move out. And it happens that the minority were the ones who said, it's wrong, we can't have a missionary society, there is no Bible for a missionary society. Those who advocated the missionary society said, we know that, there's no authority in the scriptures for a missionary society, but what we're doing doesn't work. Do you see the strange logic there? The New Testament provides nothing for it, but what the New Testament provides for converting the souls of lost mankind just doesn't work. So these were people who thought they had a better idea. Then the instrument. One of the main things that they used to justify the instrument was, we are backwoods people, and it's about time we started being like the denominations down the road. Those people are forward-thinking. They're progressive people, and they have the instrument, therefore we should have the instrument. But that is not the primary reason. I think they justified it on the basis that it would help the singing. So we're going to get into that. The last two lessons in the whole series will be the Missionary Society on one and the instrument on the other. So there we have this conflict existing. By 1906, the U.S. Census was taken, and for the first time ever, the Christian Church and the Church of Christ were listed separately. The Christian Church, in quotation marks, disciples of Christ, they were together then. Later on, the Christian Church and the disciples are going to split because the disciples become so liberal that they even deny the inspiration of the Bible. But at this time, it's the Christian Church and the Church of Christ in 1906. Well, we were the minority. We were the people that were forced out of the buildings. And it's very, very sad that to read about the people that put their whole lives into a congregation only to be shut out when the instrument was brought in. And this happened hundreds of times. Well, I want to give you the results of that census. You might be surprised. Now, remember now, in 1850, we're the fourth largest church in the United States. 1850 to 1860 were the fastest growing of any church in the United States. But by 1906, the census puts it, the figures out this way. The number of congregations left in the Church of Christ, 2,649. Christian Church, 8,293. We lost a lot, didn't we? We wound up with less than a third. Now, Earl West, in his book, Search for the Ancient Order, Volume 1, says that he believes that only about a third of the churches reported for that census. And that may be so, but it's probably so for both the Christian Church and the Church of Christ. So it could be that these figures are off, but this is all we have to go by. The number of states that had at least one congregation of the Lord's Church left, 33. The number of congregations in the South Central states, now we've got a total of 2,649, and 1,979 of them were in the South. Isaac Eric had the Standard Publishing Company up in the north. David Lipscomb had been working down the South, and some of the other more conservative brethren, through their papers, had been fighting some of these innovations. And I think that they can be given credit to a great extent for alerting the people in the South more than the people in the North about the problems that were being introduced, or the innovations and the problems that would result. The most congregations in any one state, what would it be? Take a guess. What do you think? What state had the most congregations? Kentucky. Now, what made you say that? It's not right, but it's close. It's close. Tennessee. Okay, Tennessee. And you go, and the church is still strong in Tennessee, but it's also strong in Kentucky. And I was in Kentucky not very long ago, and I loved that. And I got to go down there and see some of these restoration sites. And I'll tell you what, I was in hog heaven to see that, because I've been reading about some of these places. I love Kentucky. Okay, but there was another state that just had a few less than Tennessee, and it wasn't Kentucky, but what was it? Take a wild stab.
Arkansas.
No. It had only, let's see, what's the difference in 627 and 631? That's about four. Had only 4 congregations less than Tennessee.
Arkansas?
A man after my own heart, because I'm from Arkansas, but that's not right. we actually, Arkansas had ranked 15 in the number of congregations in the state. And I don't know why I remember that.
Oklahoma?
No, Oklahoma was in there, but not that high. Texas, absolutely. It only had four congregations less than Tennessee. So Texas is right up there fighting, but they were not number 1 in 1906. All right. The total number of church-owned buildings, 1,974, with a total value of $2,555,000. I would just imagine this building and property is probably worth that much, isn't it? But all of our property put together in 1906 was worth $2,555,000. Congregations meeting in rented halls, 693. Oh, they put us out of so many buildings. Number of preachers, we had 2,100 preachers, and they had 6,600 preachers. So you see, the liberals are always, it seems, going to appeal to the larger number of people. The numbers are significant, but the real significant thing is the fact that we were first listed separately in 1906. Number of Christian colleges left to us was 8, with a total enrollment of 1,024. Now Harding has a little over 3,000. I'm not sure about Abilene anymore, about 3,000 probably. So all of 8 of our colleges put together, we had 1,024 students. So that gives you kind of a contrast between the two. There are at least probably 2 or 3 valuable lessons, I think, to be learned from a study of this nature. Number one, let's find out what caused the break. Let's find out what caused the division. Number two, we're going to get some insights. By going back and seeing what they were doing then, is it possible that the same things that were going on then are going on now? And I guarantee you that they are. I'll tell you what, it's just shocking and appalling. Here, this is an article written by a friend of mine. In fact, it's written by me. But I listed in this, and it's called History Repeating Itself. I'm not going to read the whole article to you. But there was an article that came out in the Gospel Advocate on extremes, avoiding extremes, by Brother Harbutt. And he gives Claude Gardner the credit for compiling this list of beliefs that many of the change agents in the church today are pushing on us, as though this is something that has never been thought about before. And yet, if we are able to read history, we go back and we find that some of these things were exactly what those brethren back then were pushing on the church. Now, the church did not split in 1906. The split occurred philosophically, and for all practical purposes, and fellowship included, 20 to 25 years before that, the church was divided. All the census did was recognize what had already taken place. So, here are some of the things, and Claude Gardner, and you may know of Claude Gardner, he put this list together, that some are trying to push on the church today, that baptism is not essential to salvation. That was one of the primary things that the liberals were pushing in the late 1800s. Salvation is at the point of faith without obedience. Number 3, open fellowship should be extended to evangelical churches. Some of our brethren got so liberal that when they opened a new building, I believe that was Cincinnati, I can't recall that. Anyway, they bought a $2,500 organ and had someone from the Methodist church come down and play it for them on the opening day, and I think that may have been when they had someone from a denomination come and preach for them. Okay, number 3 was open fellowship should be extended to evangelical churches. Number 4, instrumental music and worship is acceptable. Number 5, the Church of Christ is a denomination. These are wrong, folks, but these are things that change agents would push on the church today, and they're trying to cause a split in the church. Now, if we are able to learn anything from what happened in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, please let's learn not to repeat the mistake over again. If we have any ability to learn from the past so that the future won't produce the same thing, let's do it. Number 6, women may preach, lead singing, lead prayer in public assemblies. Number 7, elders have no authority in any area. Number 8, the new hermeneutic is the proper way to establish authority. Number 9, the plea to restore the church as if it was the first century, in the first century, is irrelevant. Number 10, Christ should be preached, not the church. Number 11, the living word is more important than the written word. Number 12, the Gospels are more important than Acts through Revelation. Number 13, fellowship should be extended to all who are immersed, regardless of whether they understood they were baptized to receive the remission of sins or not. Number 14, the silence of Scripture does not limit the church's worship and work, and that was one of the things that did so much damage in the late 1800s. They said, it doesn't say not to do it. It doesn't say not to, therefore we have the right to do it. Number 15, doctrinal purity is not as important as promoting proper relationships. If any of you want a copy of that list, I'll be happy to make it for you. But let's learn from the past, not to repeat the same mistakes again. All right, on our outline, we are at the point now of number 2, the great apostasy. The church was established and organized as Jesus wanted it to be. After the apostles were gone, the changes began to occur over a period of time that we mentioned earlier, with the things taking place that changed the government, that changed the worship, and changed baptism. And I'm going to give you a list. Harold, if I could have you pass this out. This is a list of things that I've accumulated, and don't ask me where I got them all, because I just, every time I read a fact that I can plug in there, I will. But these are some things that took place. Remember, Jesus established the church just the way he wanted it to be. But along came about 154 AD, and baptism for the dead was introduced. 175 AD, or AD 175, infant baptism was introduced. Number 3, holy water was introduced in the 2nd century, but was not in general use until later. What do we have here? We have an apostate church. What is an apostate church? One that has fallen away. And they begin to add these things to the worship and to the teaching of the church. Number 4, intercession of saints. Number 5, hallowing of priestly garments. Stephen, Bishop of Rome, took the priestly garments of the Jewish priesthood and adopted it for the church. And number 6, idols were introduced. Number 7, purgatory was introduced in the 4th century. Number 8, praying for the dead appeared in the 4th century. Number 9, nuns and monks appeared in the 4th century. Elaborate program for invoking saints coming along. Services conducted in Latin rather than the language of the people. That's number 11. The Lord's Supper was changed into a Mass beginning in the 4th century. Number 11, so-called miracles appeared along with relics and images. Extreme unction, 580 AD. Worshipping of departed saints came in about 788. Number 14, near deification of Virgin Mary as Queen of Heaven. Number 15, first universal Pope, Boniface III, was crowned by Emperor Phocas in AD 606. Instrumental music. Now, you talk to the average religious person today, they just assume that instrumental music was always in the churches. Not so. It was introduced into this apostate church in 607 by Pope Vitalian, and it created such a furor that it was removed and wasn't introduced for some time later. Roman Catholicism became the official religion of the empire. All other religions were banned. Number 18, tradition was accepted along with authority, or as authority rather, in AD 869. Baptizing bells, AD 965. Celibacy of the priesthood, AD 1074. That's number 20. The 7 sacraments were introduced, AD 1130. Canonization of saints, 1160. Confession required to the priest for forgiveness of sins, 1215. Transubstantiation was established by Pope Innocent. That's where the bread and the fruit of the vine become the actual flesh and blood of Jesus. Sprinkling was substituted for immersion, 1311. The sale of indulgences in sin was introduced in the 16th century. Pope Leo X financed a good part of the building of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome by this means. Janice and I were in Rome in when was that? October, I guess, was in November. And we saw St. Peter's Basilica. So marvelous in all of its detail and so gaudy, so gold laid. I mean, it was just absolutely, a fortune was spent on that place. But part of the building of it, and in fact I've read the major part of the building of that, was financed by the selling of indulgences. You can commit adultery 5 times if you'll pay X amount of dollars, that type of thing. Simony was introduced. This is where the clergy, this is sort of reminds me of a McDonald's franchise. The clergy paid dues to the Pope for the office that they held. So the priests then reimbursed themselves by charging high prices for funerals or weddings or whatever service they performed. Now look at this. Leo X made more than $1 million a year from the sale of 2,000 offices. That's a pretty good franchise. And the Pope was given absolute authority over a temporal state covering a large part of central Italy, and that was reduced down later on. But anyway, some of the things that happened when the church went into a state of apostasy. Now, some will tell you, well, the Catholic Church was the first church, was it? No. The Catholic Church was not the first church. The church that we read about in the New Testament, the Lord's church was the first church. As the church began to fall away, somewhere it ceased to be the true church. It became a false church, a church that had fallen into apostasy. and ceased to be the large church anymore. Someone always asks, well, do you think that somebody was conducting themselves in the right way? Do you think the church existed anywhere in those days? And I like to think that it did. I like to think that there were some who could see through the errors that were being taught and practiced, and that they met in catacombs or did something that I don't know that for sure. All right, now, the apostasy was apparent to many, but what could they do about it? But gradually, some began to raise through the surface of this and say, wait a minute, what have we become? Look at us. We are as corrupt as we could be. These are the forerunners of the Reformation. This is point number 3. Is there a bell or anything that rings, Harold? Or okay, you just go like that and break me to quit. Because I won't quit unless you do that. All right, now number 3 then, Peter of Bruce, 11:10, he stood up, and you've got to give the guy credit. He was courageous, maybe not too smart, but he was courageous. He stood up and took a stand against infant baptism, transubstantiation, prayers for the dead, and costly churches, and said this is absolutely wrong. You cannot do that. This is not biblical. There is no authority for any of this. What do you suppose they did with poor Peter of Bruce? They burned him alive. Well, you can't criticize the church and get away with it. Well, then Henry of Lucerne, about 1116, he attacked the corruption of the clergy. Here was a very corrupt group of people. And Henry said, they are corrupt. I know they're priests, but they're corrupt, and they ought to repent and change their lives. They put him in prison where he died. Arnold of Brescia comes to the forefront. He headed a revolt that actually drove the Pope out of Rome and established a commune which ruled the city for several years, but eventually the Pope's people got him back in and got poor Arnold out. He was hanged. Now others tried unsuccessfully in this early period to reform the corrupt church, but there were too few, they were too weak, and the church was too strong. Now the next group that we would mention had a greater impact on the Reformation. Or these are pre-Reformation people, forerunners. There's Peter Waldo, the Waldenese sect is named after him, but Peter Waldo was a 12th century merchant of Lyons. He took an apostolic lifestyle of poverty and organized the poor men of Lyons to spread the vernacular scriptures among the people in their own language so that they could understand. Waldo financed a French translation of the New Testament. When the church refused permission for this ministry, they declared themselves independent of the Catholic Church. Persecution drove them into the rugged valleys between France and Italy and the Alps, and they remained there for several centuries. And they were there when the Reformation started, Peter Waldo and the Waldenese. Then there's John Wycliffe, about 1330 to 1384 is when he lived. The group that he was associated with were called the Lollards. Some people think that was a kind of a bad name because it meant loafer or lazy, but I'm not sure that it had that connotation. But John Wycliffe was the leader of the Lollards. Wycliffe was a professor at Oxford University in England and a very, very intelligent person, highly educated. He wrote and spoke out against the abuses of the Catholic hierarchy. He was arrested by the papal authorities and examined for his criticism, but he had friends in high places that saved his neck. And his treatment by the bishops and the Pope, though, just excited his indignation all the more, and he spoke out all the more. He had forceful attacks on Catholic doctrine and Catholic practice. And lo and behold, John Wycliffe made it to death without being put to death by the Catholic Church. But he set his followers to translating the Bible from English, and Wycliffe was the first one to provide the entire complete Bible in English to the people. He believed in the supremacy of the Scriptures over tradition. He believed the common man should have access to the Word. These were pretty revolutionary things for this time. So those who agreed with Wycliffe formed a group by the name of Lollards. By the time that Wycliffe died in 1384, his ideas had spread extensively, and a man by the name of John Huss was one of the ones who had learned from the feet of John Wycliffe, and so he became a leader within the movement. But since the Catholic Church was not able to put Wycliffe to death, and all this stuff came out, they couldn't stand it, they dug him up, and they burned his bones, and then spread his ashes around. So these are pretty nice people that they had to deal with at the time. Then the next one we would mention, I think he's number F on your list, is John Huss, who would be the leader of the Hussites, 1369, 1415. Now, he was born in Bohemia. He studied at the University of Prague and received a degree of Master of Arts and a second degree, a Bachelor of Divinity, very highly educated man. But he became a part of a group that advocated reformation of the Catholic Church. In the beginning, he worked in harmony with the church's authorities, and they had treated him as one of the intelligent ones trying to help the church reform. But the more he taught the doctrine of Wycliffe, the more they got concerned about him, and pretty soon they just cut him off and didn't give him any more public access to their pulpits to teach his doctrine. 1412, papal emissaries were sent to Prague to raise money for the intended war with the King of Naples, and they did so by selling indulgence in sin. And Huss stood on his back legs and said, "This is wrong, this can't be." And so he was excommunicated, and not only that, but it was aggravation of the sentence, was what they called it, was declared, and the Pope was ready to suspend sentence, and Huss got out of town. Later, he decided to present himself at the General Council in Constance, and he wanted to explain to the Catholic leaders there what his ideas were about reform, that it was really the thing to do, and so he presented himself so that he would be given a platform to speak. They arrested him, and they brought an end to his life. July the 6th, 1415, he was burned at the stake alive. So this is all done in the name of religion, and we scratch our heads and say, how could they be so cruel to each other? How could they be so ignorant? But this was a time of ignorance, and the Catholic Church had complete control over the people. And until something could happen, that the common man could begin to read for himself, this was going to continue. I might mention two or three others. The Albigensists became a prominent group in southern France. 1130, they were opposed to the traditions of the authority of the church. They were opposed to the doctrines of purgatory. They were opposed to image worship. They recognized the authority of the New Testament and circulated it to the best of their ability among the people. But Pope Innocent III called for an attack on these people, and they were completely annihilated. Absolutely murdered, all of them. But that was done in the name of religion to keep these people from rising up and saying that what the Catholic Church taught was wrong. John Wessel was a reformer of less renown than Wycliffe and Huss. However, he attacked Catholicism, and some of the principal features about it and some of the things that he taught became some of the things that Martin Luther taught. And I've got to mention one more, Jerome Savonarola. I had to mention that because I like to say his last name, Savonarola. He was a priest in Florence, Italy. He denied the authority of the Pope and made a bitter fight against immorality in the clergy. And in Fisher's History of the Christian Church, it says on page 276, when the Pope found that he could not bribe the powerful preacher with the offer of a cardinal's hat or reduce him to silence by repeating admonitions, he excommunicated him. Savonarola pronounced this excommunication void. He was finally arrested, and while in prison, he wrote a tract about the justification. He was tried, he was condemned, he was burned alive in 1498. So, nice people that we're dealing with here who would treat good, honest, sincere people who were saying, this is not right. But this is all an effort to reform an apostate church. What we're going to be talking about a little later on is a restoration. And reformation, it's hard, as somebody put it, it's hard to get the fox out of the hen house when he's controlling all the hens. So you're better off just to go back forget the hen house, and go back and try to restore what it ought to be. And these men, they tried desperately to reform, and they were making a little headway, but not enough. The Protestant Reformation is where we're going to start next week, and we're going to be getting into to some people that you're familiar with, at least by name, and we look forward to being with you then. And I hope tonight it's not been too hard on learning some of these things that went on, because this is just history. I didn't create it. I'm not going to cover it up, because that is what was happening back in these days. Cover up, don't allow the people to speak. But this is history. We'll get past this, and we're going to find some interesting people to talk about. Thank you.